Hi there, I'm Katie Walton from Makeville Progress, and I'm a leadership development specialist and coach. And I'm absolutely passionate in helping people to get the right practical skills and tools to be able to make the difference that they want to make. So today I'm working on behalf of the NHS Southeast Leadership Academy, and I'm recording a series of leadership shorts for you based around challenging conversations. So there's going to be 3 videos in total, each about 10 to 15 minutes long. And this is the first of 3 on challenging conversations, and it focuses on the relationships first of all. Now, the reason why the relationship part is so important is because if we have all 3 of these different areas in place, we have good, solid relationships, we have thought about our thinking, and we have the right words, then it's entirely likely that our conversations become less challenging and actually more realistic to achieve. And ultimately, whenever we want or need to have a challenging conversation with somebody, we want a great outcome. We want the result at the end of the conversation, and we want our relationships to stay intact. So this session today is all about thinking about the relationships, and we can't always have the luxury of spending a lot of time to get to know people to build really solid relationships. So in times when we're having to work with someone who's fairly new to us, we also need to think about how we can build relationships quite rapidly as well. First of all, though, I'd like you to pause for a second and to think about what is it that tips a conversation into the realms of being challenging for you. For some of you, it may be one individual who, when you even think of them, you start getting your hackles rising a little bit. For others of you, it could be a trait or a characteristic of somebody that you find really difficult to work with. And for others of us, it can be thinking about the emotions that it might raise in the other person and in ourselves. So typically, as soon as we start to think of any conversation as being a challenging conversation, it immediately provokes the sympathetic nervous system to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And it can distort the way that we're reacting and we're responding. So think about what is it that moves a conversation into a challenging conversation, and perhaps maybe consider removing the word challenging away altogether, and think about this as having a conversation with somebody. Now, whether that is a conversation with a colleague, to call them out, perhaps their behaviour is out of line with NHS values. Perhaps it's with a senior member of staff when you've spotted something that's not quite right. Or perhaps it's with one of your direct reports and you need to be giving them some feedback on a piece of work or their performance, which isn't quite up to scratch. Anything that you need to have that feels like it's going to be quite challenging, that's how we can help with this, the whole series of 3 videos on challenging conversations. So first of all, if we're thinking about building relationships as having a solid foundation for a good conversation to take place, that's really helpful. And what that means is over the longer term, if possible, if we're working with an intact team or some people who we see very regularly, this is great because it's a great opportunity for us to build those foundations. And we typically build those foundations through getting to know, like, and trust people. Now, if you've never heard of Amy Cuddy before, she's a social psychologist who works for Harvard. And she talks about the fact that from an evolutionary perspective, it's incredibly important for us to know, first of all, whether somebody deserves our trust. So if you think about it in prehistoric times, we needed to know whether somebody was trustworthy before we knew that, before we wanted to know whether they were competent enough to be able to light a fire. And it's this part that's often quite missing for us because from quite a young age, when we start work, we're told to be more professional. We're told to be competent and display our competence. And so for many of us, it's this competence factor which tends to get in the way when we are looking to build really effective human relationships with people. And actually, if we go back to this house analogy, sometimes it's our egos that get in the way of having a really good conversation with somebody because we are more likely to want to prove that we're right than to stop and listen and consider the fact that we might actually be wrong. We might be seeing something from a different perspective of somebody else. So let's think about how we can build trust with people. And building trust with people is all about three human elements in particular. And that's helping to make sure that people feel seen, heard, and understood. And we do that by stopping, listening, asking questions, and focusing our attention on them rather than on us. And here's where it gets really challenging, because when we're focusing on the other person, we're not thinking about our needs and what we are trying to put across. Now, let me give you an example of something that's quite topical at the time of recording. So, Brexit. I might have a view that I want to leave, and a friend of mine might have a view that they want to remain. Now, if I'm so fixated on what I want, then when I'm in any conversation, I can feel myself getting quite heated quite quickly because I want to put my perspective across. I want to be seen as right. I want to win the argument, win the conversation. As soon as we're starting to think about winning a conversation and putting across our perspective, we're not truly listening to the other person. So remember, if we're trying to build trust first, it's about really listening and hearing the other person, what they have to say. And this is where it gets quite tough, especially if we're feeling quite anxious, emotional, fearful, or whatever. So let's park our own agenda and focus on what the other person is saying so we can truly hear them. I wonder, when was the last time you had a good listening to, or the last time you gave somebody a good listening to? And it doesn't even need to be a really long conversation. It could just be pausing. And instead of thinking about what you want to say, stopping and listening and hearing what the other person has to say, first of all. Fundamental for us in building trust. So I want to introduce you quickly to an overview of a book, which I think is a phenomenal one to think about some founding principles for building great relationships at work. And it's by a woman called Kim Scott. And she talks about fundamentally two principles, and that's caring personally about other people and at the same time being able to challenge directly. So there's a couple of things that make that quite tricky. And that's why she calls it radical candor. So it's not about being radical, it's the fact that it's quite radical to get that combination right of caring about somebody and being able to challenge directly. And when she's talking about challenging directly, she's talking about the ability to ruffle a few feathers. And that's quite a rare combination, actually. So if you think about it, remember I was saying earlier, often when we start work, we're really concerned about being professional. We often have a professional mask and we forget about being human. We forget about caring about the other person. And you couple that with the fact that the majority of us from quite a young age were told, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. So the ability to ruffle a few feathers might feel quite alien and quite difficult from us. And actually, if you're operating from a place of being very caring about other people, the challenge directly dimension can feel quite tough. What I particularly like about this grid and this axis is the fact that Kim has labeled the different quadrants about what happens when we forget one of the elements. So if we forget to care personally, and so we're leading with this need to challenge, to be right, to put our point of view across really directly, what that can look like is obnoxious aggression, which is clearly not a great place to be. However, what tends to happen when people aren't getting results from the obnoxious aggression, rather than thinking about the human side and caring personally, we can tend to go the other way, the wrong way. And actually, this manipulative insincerity is diametrically opposed to where we want to be. And when you're being manipulatively insincere, you're not caring about the other person, nor are you giving them the opportunity to find out what feedback you want to give. So this is the domain of backstabbing, talking about people behind their back or being passive aggressive. The other place that's not a great place to be is when you don't challenge directly because you care so much about the other person. You don't want to hurt their feelings, or perhaps your natural instinct isn't to speak up either. So if you're operating from this place, ruinous empathy, it means that you're not telling somebody something that they need to hear, actually. And I love this quote from Simon Sinek when he's talking about the fact that trust is built on telling people the truth, not on telling people what they want to hear. And that can be quite a challenge for us. So if we're talking about building radically candid relationships, what does that mean? So radical candor is all about being kind, clear, and immediate. And that's about giving people both positive and negative feedback directly and as soon as possible after whatever it is has happened. If you're being obnoxiously aggressive, so signs to look out for is that brutal honesty. So if you've ever given someone some feedback and in the guise of, well, it's just feedback, they need to hear it, just think about whether you might be able to dial up the caring personally bit a little bit. Manipulative insincerity, not a place to go to at all, but sometimes a place that we can feel drawn to if we're not caring enough about the other person. And ruinous empathy, this is all about the real sugar-coated praise or no criticism at all. It's not helpful for people in the long run. And remember, if we're wanting to have a challenging conversation, it's because we want an outcome. We want something to be different as a result of the conversation. So, kind, clear, and immediate, and both positive and negative. If you want to build radically candid relationships, first of all, you need to get it for yourself. This is a really great way to build trust. Ask people for their feedback about you, and I'll come on to exactly what you need to do in a sec. But then you can give it. Get it first, and then practice giving it to other people. Gauging it is about figuring out how it's landing with people. And on my other videos, when we talk about mindset and words, you'll get a bit more background around that. But gauging it is thinking, has my feedback landed well? And then encouraging it is if you see that manipulative insincerity, that drama, the backstabbing with other people, is encouraging people to be radically candid themselves instead of being pulled into that drama yourself. So when you see a couple of people talking about a colleague or talking about a team leader and saying this person is doing this person's doing that, encourage them. Have you told them? Have you spoken to them directly and honestly? So when you're getting that radical candor from other people, this is about asking them for feedback. So asking for feedback first is the kind of thing that really encourages it in other people. So you might need to ask questions to dig a bit deeper. So for example, if I'm asking people for feedback about me, typically, if people are caring personally and they're leading with that, they're often really quite nice, quite fluffy in their feedbacks. They might say lovely things that I want to hear. Oh, Katie, you were brilliant at that meeting, for example. But that's not enough. If you're really encouraging radical candor, you want to ask some questions to dig a bit deeper and say something like, well, thank you, that's great to hear, but I really want to focus on doing things differently. So what specifically could I do differently? So you're asking questions to explore a little bit further. One of the hardest things when you're asking for feedback is to put aside any defensiveness, justification, or ego and just accept what they're telling you. So if people are giving you feedback, remember it could be really challenging for them. So to keep that relationship really strong, you thank them. That's great to hear. Thank you very much. So in terms of relationships and how they help with challenging conversations, if you can focus first on building relationships, building trust with people, so remember that's listening, hearing, and understanding them, you get a really, really good foundation to work on. It gives you permission to go there with a more challenging or difficult conversation or topic. Have a balance between caring personally and challenging directly, and make sure that you park what it is that you have to say for a second and think about it from the other person's perspective. Have you really taken time to see, hear, and understand their perspective? If you have any questions or you want to speak to somebody from the leadership team for some more information, here are the details for them. But in the meantime, you might like to check out the other couple of videos that I'll be recording on challenging conversations. One of them is going to be on mindset, and one of them is going to be on the words that you can use. Thanks for listening.